this morning we have an interesting show for you. You haven't really heard much about the Anti-Gang Act since it was proclaimed back in May, since it became law. We want to start the discussion off this morning on that note, talking about the Anti-Gang Act, but more in terms of education and educating the youth. I have with me Mr. Zahir Ali, who is the chairman of the Zahir Ali Foundation and also an attorney. Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you, sir?
I'm very well.
I know I got you to get up early this morning, so it's a pleasure having you with us.
Well, I think that's a good motivator this morning.
You see, Mr. Ali, I want to start by asking you to tell me a little bit about the Zahir Ali Foundation.
Well, the Zahir Ali Foundation was incorporated in October of 2013. It's a non-governmental, non-profit organization incorporated with the Ministry of Legal Affairs. The general focus of the organization is on youth and community development in Trinidad and Tobago. We focus on youth and community development in a multifaceted way, looking at educational workshops, looking at aspects of the environment, looking at helping the differently able, less privileged, and other aspects that we think are relevant to youth and community development in Trinidad and Tobago. The organization in itself comprises professionals in different walks of life. The sole intention behind that is to ensure that we get that multifaceted approach when we are interacting with the young people of Trinidad and Tobago and communities.
Right. And now you want to protect our nation's youth through educational enforcement of the Anti-Gang Act. Tell me about that.
Well, very interesting topic. When the foundation sat down and looked at their educational programs, and with the introduction of the anti-gang legislation, we had a very, very close read of that particular piece of legislation. And what we have found is that there is a role for non-governmental organizations and other non-law enforcement bodies to play a role in the enforcement of that legislation. It's a very interesting piece of legislation, and we think the time has come to ensure that there's simultaneous or a complemented approach to law enforcement efforts in the enforcement of the anti-gang legislation. When one look at the preamble or the title to the legislation, it clearly indicates to discourage gang membership and other related activities. So part of discouraging, we see an educational enforcement as critical in the enforcement of the legislation.
And you want to educate the youth in particular?
Well, definitely. When you look at what's happening in our country today, it's important for us to ensure that we use the law to protect the young people who we believe may be vulnerable and impressionable to gang and gang-related activities. We are hoping to direct the educational enforcement to the secondary level of education, where the youths at that stage, they are very, as I said, impressionable and vulnerable to exploit these sort of activities. So yes, we think that the law has to be used not only in restoring safety and security, but ensuring that it used as a protection measure for our youths in particular, but the general national public.
As a deterrent, so you use the law to say this is what you don't do.
Exactly. What we found is that the parliament legislates, they introduce laws, but really what are the real focus and purpose of the law? The law has to be brought as simple as possible to the people who it has the capacity to affect. And if you look at our nation youths, most of those individuals will not go into the law books, would not take time to go and look and see what is prohibited and what is not prohibited. So we think that as an organization, and we are calling on the national public to play their role in ensuring that the provisions of the anti-gang legislation, that the youths in particular understand the law and the consequences of their actions.
Yeah. And you want to start at secondary schools because you think that there is where the youth, they are most vulnerable.
Yeah, I think when you look at the primary school, they are still in their primitive stage. While we have seen acts of violence in the primary schools, we think that is more prevalent at the secondary school, and at the secondary school level, the youths are now beginning to discover themselves. So we think that that may, from a psychological perspective, we are advised as a foundation that it may be the appropriate area to start making that introduction.
But if you look at the secondary school system now, and you see it all over social media and sometimes in the news of fights in school all the time, I mean, if you go to do this, not all the children may listen and hear what you're saying. And even if they do, if some want to, they may be influenced by people on the outside. How do we combat something like that?
Well, you see, immediately, when you're looking at small, what we may classify as small acts of indiscipline or violence, that is an early indicator that that particular child or that particular group needs some sort of intervention. And that is why we are actually indicating as well in our enforcement efforts. We are suggesting that the persons with the specialist skills, the psychologists, the psychiatrists, the law enforcement officers, and other professionals will get on board to ensure that we reach the minds of these children. So in the program, it has to be tailored to suit the target audience as well, so that they will be motivated to participate in the discussion.
Now, the foundation is adamant that its call for the educational enforcement of the Anti-Gang Act in the nation's schools is legally justified.
Well, when you look at the general purpose of the Education Act, and when you look at the duties of the Children's Authority Board, when you look at the Children's Act in its context, and when you look at the International Convention on the Child, there's a common denominator that any decision that has to be taken must be taken in the best interest of the child and in protection of the child. So here we have a piece of law in the context of an anti-gang legislation, and I wish to stretch it to maybe criminal law in general. That if we have laws that are prohibiting behavior, and we have a national problem, or we are foreseeing that we may have a bigger problem in the near future, it's important for every single stakeholder to use the law effectively and to ensure that the law reaches the people who it's supposed to reach.
But what role do parents play?
Well, definitely in this entire process, what you will find in the enforcement strategy is that there will be an area where parents will be invited to understand how they can be culpable if they don't execute their duties under the anti-gang legislation. Because I don't know if you had read of the legislation, but the legislation, there's a provision that speaks about the parent knowing or exercising due diligence in relation to children who may be involved in gang-related activities, because they can be caught within the armpits of the law.
Especially if they're under 18.
Especially because they have that responsibility for the child.
Yeah. There was something with the statement that you had issued about this that stood out to me, because you said that there is a general perception that the Anti-Gang Act is a law enforcement tool designed for prosecutorial purposes, but that is not your view.
It's a primary aim, but as I said, if you look at the true purpose of the law, if we were to be successful as a law enforcement body to arrest and prosecute every single gang member or gang leader at this present point in time, there's still no guarantee that the young people understand consequences of the law and consequences of their action. So while you have the prosecutorial aspect of it, it must be complemented with the social intervention of the anti-gang legislation. So you're not only looking to detect, but you're looking to deter and discourage at the same time.
Yeah, because while you say that, I'm thinking, you know, what if the children come from a home where the parents may not be working, or they don't have that big income and may see other people having something and they may want it, and then the children may think, you know, what is the quickest way for me to get money, and then they could get themselves involved in gang activity. This program should address things like that. Well, is that the hope? Well,
definitely. If you look at the concept behind the call for the enforcement of the anti-gang legislation, you'll recognize that when we create or introduce the opportunity to interact, and the professionals interacting with these young people, we will be in a position to immediately determine whether a child has those sort of vulnerabilities in relation to wants and needs and affiliations and associations. So immediately you start looking beyond the child. So the child in the first context is the first point of contact. But after discussions, and as I said in the call, by interacting with them, you're going to give them an opportunity to be heard as well. So a child may come and let you know, listen, I am facing X problem, or I'm facing Y problem. And this is where the general stakeholders, the various ministries, sport, youth affairs, social development, the Ministry of Health, these are where all these ministries will start to play their part in the general enforcement of the legislation in various aspects.
Yeah. But what would this look like in terms of, would it be a program where people go into the schools and sit and chat with the children? Would it be, what would be the structure? How would you propose something?
Well, I'm happy that you asked that. I think that the time has come for us to have a national uniform standard intervention. And I say this to bring it in the context of a crime prevention awareness campaign. We know that children are always vulnerable, and they are exposed to a lot of external factors. And we are saying that if we package this thing properly, and make it attractive to young people, have them participate in workshops, seminars, maybe little incentives and so forth to be part of it, I think that the national campaign will explain clearly that there's definitely an interest in this topic, and young people may be gravitated to get involved. Additionally, we have, right now we're in an area of sport. You know, we have CPL in a big way. You know, we want to use our sporting icons to come down to assist in the social intervention as well, so that they can actually sell this product to the young people, which are in dire need of this product.
Yeah. And then how would this campaign, yes, you talk to them, but how do we follow up after that? Would there be a system for that?
Well, definitely. When we making the intervention in the school, what we will create is a system with the principals and maybe the dean of discipline, whoever individual has the responsibility for discipline and general behavior, to keep that collaboration and that network with these individuals, so that we can actually build on the statistics and actually consistently monitor whether the intervention is actually making an impact, or whether we need to tweak in any other way to address the particular instance.
Yeah. Now, I read where you said that combating gang and gang-related activities require a balance and, where necessary, simultaneous focus on the prosecutorial and educational strategies for the successful enforcement of the Anti-Gang Act. I want to focus on that a bit.
Well, when you look at, if you look at the dynamics, you realize that the communities are being absorbed into gang and gang-related activities. And one may ask, from a psychological perspective, why is that? And it's, you know, the layman may answer it and say that, okay, maybe the gang member or the gang leader has the resources to, you know, generate to the general community development, youth development. And if we do not replace that contribution that the gang or the gang member makes in the community with lawful efforts, you find that they are going to continue to dominate the community. So it's important for, when we looking to arrest, detect, and prosecute, that there's something that is waiting to replace when we actually extract, when the law enforcement extract those perpetrators. There must be a replacement from a social perspective to replace the wants and needs of these young people who are vulnerable to these gang members and gang leaders.
But what about people who are already involved in gangs, young people who are already involved in gangs? Do you think a program like this might be able to encourage them to come out? How would that work?
Well, definitely. If you look at the legislation as well, the legislation creates an opportunity for persons who may have gotten themselves involved to come to the legal authority to actually get out of the gang. But additionally, and more importantly, the whole aspect of education also impacts the rehabilitation process. So you don't only wait for someone to be charged and placed in a prison, and then you are looking now to diagnose the problem with education and rehabilitation measures. Before they actually commit an act, or before they are actually caught in the arms of law enforcement, the educational approach is a rehabilitation tool, and it's a proactive way of addressing this matter.
Why now, though? Why not before?
Well, the organization have sat down, as I said, and looked at this in context. We were looking on closely in relation to how this legislation is being applied, and what we recognize is that there's a burden on law enforcement, and we are seeing that the nation is sitting back and with the hope, and I say this respectfully, that law enforcement will make the necessary dent that we all require. But this is a problem that requires national effort, and how could the national community play their role? It's very simple. They don't have the powers of the police, they don't have the powers of other law enforcement authorities, but what they have the power to do is to use their hands and tongue to disseminate the information that the anti-gang possesses for discouraging gang membership.
But there are so many situations where you see young people being disrespectful to those in authority, even police officers. You see it, they post videos all the time. Children in school uniform, they do that in poorer communities within Trinidad as well. Is it that they were brought up like that? And how do we change that mentality? And how do we convince parents as well that, you know, we need to guide our children in a certain direction?
Well, you see, Rishi, we have to be realistic. We have to be real. Not everyone going to be fortunate to be or find themselves in the proper home or around the proper people. And this is where the responsible persons in society, those who are entrusted with public responsibility, those who have corporate responsibility, have to recognize that the young people are the human resource, whether it be the public sector, private sector, and play their part in getting to these homes, getting to these communities to ensure that they assist in that development process. What we found is we have things happening in isolation. What you need is a national standardized intervention to create that sort of awareness and interest in topic of discussion.
Have you approached any government ministries or anybody with this
Well, definitely. As a matter of fact, later this morning, we are having a discussion with the directors of the organization, and we are going to further this call this morning by approaching the Ministry of Attorney General, the Ministry of Education, the Minister of National Security, and the Commissioner of Police and his executive to sit and have a discussion so that we can further explain exactly how we in particular and how the national community could play a role in the crime prevention measures.
What is your long-term vision?
My long-term vision is after 30 months of this legislation, that when the time comes to review this legislation, we would not be reviewing this legislation in the context of how many persons have been charged or how many persons have been prosecuted, how many persons have been convicted, but we want to go a little bit further. How many persons, from a statistics perspective, from an interpretation perspective, that we can determine that the anti-gang legislation, through its educational enforcement, we were in a position to deter.
Yeah, because this legislation came into effect in the latter part of May, and it is only in place for 2 years.
That's correct. So therefore, time is also of the essence. And while it's a very, very stringent law, if I may say that, I think that the time period in which the law exists, we must maximize that period in ensuring that the law achieves its full potential, both from, as I said, from a prosecutorial perspective and from a social intervention, educational perspective.
Mr. Zahir Ali, I would like to thank you very much for taking the time to come and chat with us this morning about some of your ideas and what you want to see take place, especially with the Anti-Gang Act. I was speaking there with Mr. Zahir Ali, who is the chairman of the Zahir Ali Foundation and attorney at law. This is Good Morning Trinidad and Tobago. We take a break and come back with me.